Get out. You're finished here. The words hit the emergency department like a gunshot. CEO Grant Holloway's voice cut across the trauma bay, and every nurse, doctor, and orderly froze. Emily Hayes stood at the center of it all, 31 years old, 5'4", still holding a patient chart, as her supervisor physically reached over and pulled the badge from her lanyard. The plastic clattered on the tile floor. Nobody moved to pick it up. Nobody said a word. Then the front doors of Meridian General burst open, and a 4-star general in full-dress uniform walked through them with 6 armed soldiers at his back. He stopped, scanned the room, and asked one question. "Where's Nurse Emily Hayes?" If you're still watching, follow this channel right now, hit like, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Let's go. The badge was still on the floor when General Victor Maddox walked in. Emily hadn't moved yet. She was standing 6 feet from where Holloway had yanked the lanyard off her neck, and her hands were at her sides, and her face was doing that thing it sometimes did under pressure. Going completely still, like a lake surface the moment before a storm hits. The other nurses were watching her. 3 residents who had been arguing over a chart 2 minutes ago were now just standing there with their mouths open. Dr. Priya Okafor, the attending on duty, had taken 2 steps toward Holloway during the firing and then stopped herself, which Emily had noticed and appreciated and filed away. Holloway hadn't noticed. Holloway was still talking. "Security will escort you to collect your personal items from the locker room," he said. He had the kind of voice that worked well in boardrooms. Smooth, practiced, the volume always just slightly too loud for whatever room he was in. "Your access card will be deactivated within the hour. I'd suggest you not make this difficult." "I'm not making anything difficult," Emily said. "You made it difficult when you went over my head to the compliance office." "I made a report. That's what the compliance office is for." Holloway's jaw shifted. He was 53, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who wore his salary in the way he stood. He looked at Emily the way people sometimes look at a vending machine that's eaten their dollar, annoyed briefly before moving on to the next one. "Your employment with Meridian General is terminated, effective immediately, for insubordination and breach of confidentiality." He said it like he was reading from a teleprompter. Maybe he had practiced it. "That is final." Emily looked at him for a moment, then she looked at the badge on the floor. She didn't pick it up. "Fine," she said. That was it. That was all she gave him. What she didn't give him was the explanation. That 3 days ago she'd been auditing supply orders for the trauma wing and found billing codes attached to procedures that hadn't happened. Not once, not twice. 47 instances across 6 months attached to patients who were either unconscious, deceased, or had never received the care the codes described. She'd flagged it to her direct supervisor first. Her supervisor had told her to let it go. She'd flagged it to the department head. He'd told her to let it go. She'd gone to compliance on a Tuesday afternoon and filled out a formal report with documentation, and by Thursday morning, Grant Holloway was standing in the middle of the emergency department, removing her badge in front of 11 staff members. She had not let it go. She picked up her coffee thermos from the nurse's station counter. She unclipped her personal pen from her breast pocket. She looked once at the board on the wall. 14 active patients, 3 in critical status, 1 waiting for a procedure that was already 40 minutes delayed because the surgical resident scheduled for it had called out sick, and nobody had covered the gap yet. She almost said something about that. She stopped herself. The walk to the locker room took 4 minutes. The security guard who escorted her was a 22-year-old named Marcus, who she'd spoken to maybe once before, and he didn't make eye contact, and she didn't blame him. She packed her things in a canvas tote, a spare set of compression socks, a granola bar she'd forgotten about, a small framed photo of her and her sister at a lake somewhere in Wyoming, a field manual she'd been rereading for no particular reason except that old habits die slowly, and sometimes not at all. She was almost to the lobby when the intercom went off. Not the regular intercom. The emergency channel. The tone was different. 2 short bursts instead of 1, which meant the call was coming from city dispatch rather than internal triage. Meridian General, this is Hargrove County Emergency Coordination. We have a confirmed multi-casualty event, commuter train derailment at the Junction Street crossing, preliminary report of 60 to 90 victims, fire and rescue on scene. First transport en route to your facility. Estimated arrival 4 minutes. All available trauma personnel to staging. Emily stopped walking. The lobby was already beginning to move. Nurses jogging from the elevator, an orderly pushing an empty gurney toward the ER entrance, someone from the administrative office standing in a doorway with their hand pressed flat against the wall like the building itself had shifted. Marcus, the security guard, was looking at his radio. Emily stood in the middle of it and did the math. 60 to 90 victims. 4 minutes. The trauma bay at Meridian General had 8 beds with full equipment access and 2 additional overflow positions that required portable units to be staged manually. The surgical team on duty today was Dr. Okafor, one first-year resident, and a second-year who was covering 2 departments simultaneously because of the staffing gap. The head of trauma surgery, Dr. Lennox Farrell, was somewhere in the building but had been in an administrative meeting for the past hour and a half. 4 minutes. She turned around. Marcus said, "Ms. Hayes." "I know," she said. "I'm not employed here. I heard the man." She walked back through the lobby doors. Autumn. The first ambulance arrived in 3 minutes and 40 seconds. By the time it pulled in, Emily had already located Dr. Okafor near the trauma bay entrance, given her a 30-second summary of what the transport capacity situation was going to look like in the next 20 minutes, and convinced a charge nurse named Delilah, who had worked at Meridian for 11 years and had approximately zero tolerance for nonsense under any circumstances, to pull the 2 portable trauma units from storage and get them staged before the first patient was even unloaded. Okafor looked at her. "You're terminated." "I'm aware. Holloway's going to... He can fire me again when this is over." Emily pulled on a pair of gloves from the box on the wall. "Get me the most critical patient when they come in." Okafor hesitated for exactly 2 seconds. Then, "Fine, but you're documented as volunteer status only." "Fine." The first patient was a 40-year-old man with blunt chest trauma and a suspected tension pneumothorax. His trachea was already shifting, his breath sounds on the right side were absent, and the paramedic who brought him in was doing compressions with one hand and holding an oxygen mask with the other, and looked like she hadn't slept in 30 hours. Emily talked to the patient while she assessed him, not because it was protocol, but because he was conscious and scared people in medical crises sometimes do dangerous things like try to sit up or pull their IVs out. "Hey, I need you to stay with me. What's your name?" The man's lips moved. "Derek?" "Derek? Good. I'm Emily. You were on the train?" "Yeah." His voice was wet and thin. "Yeah, I was. There was a noise and then everything just... You're at the hospital now. We're going to take care of you." She turned to the resident beside her. "Get me a 14-gauge needle, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Right now." The resident froze for half a second. He was a first year, she could tell from the way he moved, the slight hesitation before every action. And then he moved. The decompression needle went in. The rush of air was immediate. Derek's oxygen saturation began climbing on the monitor. The second ambulance pulled in before she'd finished securing the dressing. By the time the third arrived, the trauma bay was full, and the overflow positions were active, and there was a system of sorts in place. Not a perfect system, not a textbook system, but a working one, with clear lanes for critical patients and a secondary triage area for walking wounded that one of the nurses had set up in the waiting room, using nothing but a whiteboard and a lot of authority in her voice. That nurse was Delilah, who had apparently decided at some point in the last 15 minutes to stop waiting for someone to tell her what to do and just do it. Emily passed her in the corridor during a brief gap between transports. "You ran mass casualty drills?" Emily asked. "Twice a year. Never actually needed them." "You're running one now." Delilah looked at her. "You some kind of ER specialist?" "Something like that." She wasn't lying. She was also not explaining, which she'd learned was sometimes the better option when the conversation was going to take longer than you had time for. She'd done this before. Not in a civilian hospital. The geometry was different. The resources were different. The chaos had a different texture. But the core of it was the same. Mass casualty events don't wait for the right people to be in the room. They arrive and they keep arriving, and the only thing that matters is what you do in the first 90 seconds after the first patient hits your door, because that decision shapes every decision that comes after it. She'd learned that in a forward operating base in a country she still couldn't talk about publicly. She'd learned it from a surgeon named Trevino who'd worked in conditions that would have shut down most civilian ORs entirely, who told her once that the difference between a nurse and a combat nurse was that a combat nurse understood the difference between what you wished you had and what you actually had. Work with what you have. She was working. The fourth transport brought in a teenage girl, maybe 15, maybe 16, with a femur fracture and a laceration across her right forearm that had been wrapped in someone's jacket at the scene. The girl was crying but controlled, which meant she was coherent, which meant Emily moved her to the secondary triage area and squeezed her hand once before moving back to the bay. "You're going to be okay," Emily told her. "Someone will be with you in a few minutes." "My mom was on the train," the girl said. Emily stopped. "What's your name?" "Sophia." "Sophia, we're going to find out about your mom, okay? Can you tell me what she looks like?" Sophia described her. Emily relayed the description to Marcus, who had apparently decided on his own that his job tonight included being a communication relay between triage areas, and who took the description without comment and went to check. She didn't know if the mother had come in yet. She didn't know if the mother had survived. She kept moving. Grant Holloway appeared at the trauma bay entrance at 6:47 p.m. He'd clearly been watching from somewhere nearby, maybe the administrative corridor that ran parallel to the ER, and he looked like a man trying to decide whether the fire in front of him was his problem or someone else's. He landed on someone else's. "Hayes." His voice cut through the noise. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Emily was in the middle of adjusting an IV line. She didn't look up. "Starting a second drip, the first one infiltrated." "You don't work here." "I'm volunteering." She looked up then, briefly. "You can document it however you want." "I'm calling security." "That's your right." She went back to the line. "Marcus is in the waiting room coordinating secondary triage if you need him." Holloway's face went through several stages of something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite embarrassment, a kind of frustrated helplessness that people sometimes get when the situation has moved past their ability to control it. And they haven't caught up yet. He stood there for another moment. Then Dr. Okafor appeared beside Emily, not looking at Holloway, addressing Emily directly. "I need you in Bay 3. Possible internal bleed, BP is dropping." Emily stripped the gloves and grabbed a clean pair and followed Okafor. And Holloway was still standing in the entrance behind them. He didn't follow. He didn't call security. He went back to the administrative corridor, and Emily didn't watch him go because she was already in Bay 3. And the patient in Bay 3 was a 68-year-old man named Arthur, whose blood pressure was 84/50 and still dropping, and Arthur was what mattered. Arthur was a retired electrician from the Millbrook Heights neighborhood who'd been on his way to pick up his granddaughter from a piano recital. He told her this in fragments while she worked. The recital, the granddaughter, the fact that his wife was going to be furious that he'd taken that particular train instead of driving. He was trying to be funny about it. People sometimes got funny right before they got very bad, and Emily recognized the pattern and picked up the pace of her assessment accordingly. "You're not going to miss that recital," she told him. "She'll play it again for you." "She will not. She hates repeating things." "Sounds like someone I know." Arthur almost smiled. Then his eyes went wrong, that particular blankness that meant his pressure had dropped again. And Emily called for Okafor, and for the ultrasound cart, and for 2 units of O negative, and the room shifted into a different gear, and Arthur went to surgery 12 minutes later, which was 3 minutes faster than standard protocol, and exactly as fast as it needed to be. She didn't know yet whether Arthur made it. She moved to the next patient. It was 7:23 p.m. when the sound changed outside. She almost missed it. She was in the middle of consulting with the second-year resident about a patient with a possible spinal injury. The positioning question was complicated, and the resident was good but uncertain, and Emily was talking through it in the same flat, practical tone she used for everything. When she heard it, rotors, not one, multiple. The kind of overlapping beat that meant military aircraft, not medevac. She'd heard that sound in enough places that it lived somewhere in her body rather than her brain. Not a memory exactly, more like a reflex. She kept talking to the resident. She finished the positioning recommendation. She walked with him to the patient and helped him confirm the assessment. Then she went to the window at the end of the corridor. 3 Black Hawk helicopters were settling onto the grassy field across from the hospital's main entrance. Their running lights strobed in the early evening dark. As she watched, the side door of the nearest aircraft slid open. The man who stepped out first wasn't in combat gear. He was in dress uniform. Army, full insignia, the kind of uniform that only comes out for specific occasions. She couldn't see his face from this distance. She could see the rank on his shoulders. 4 stars. She stood at the window for 3 seconds, then she went back to work. She was triaging a woman with a dislocated shoulder. The woman was a teacher, kept apologizing for taking up space, which was something Emily had noticed civilians did a lot in medical situations, apologize for their own injuries, when she heard the footsteps in the corridor. Not hospital footsteps. Hospital footsteps were shoes on tile, the specific rhythm of people who spent 12 hours on their feet and had learned to move efficiently. These were boots, measured cadence, multiple sets. She heard Holloway's voice from somewhere near the nurse's station, not his usual boardroom voice, something higher, less controlled. "General, I don't know what... I'm not sure how we can help the military, but if you need to speak with someone in administration..." The responding voice was lower, steady. "I didn't come to speak with administration." Emily finished the shoulder assessment. She wrote her notes on the patient's chart. She told the woman with the dislocated shoulder that someone would be in to reduce the joint in the next 15 minutes, and that it was going to hurt briefly but feel considerably better afterward. And the woman said thank you and meant it in the specific way people mean things when they've been scared and someone has been kind to them. She turned around. General Victor Maddox was standing at the entrance to the triage area. He was 61 years old, with a face that looked like it had been through several kinds of weather, and taken none of them personally. Behind him were 2 aides and a man in civilian clothes who had federal law enforcement written all over him in ways that had nothing to do with any badge. Maddox looked at Emily. Emily looked at Maddox. Something crossed his face that wasn't quite recognition. It was more like confirmation, like a man checking a coordinate against a map he'd already memorized. "Lieutenant Hayes," he said. She hadn't been called that in 4 years. "Sir?" she said. Holloway was right behind the general, slightly to his left, wearing an expression Emily had never seen on him before. It looked something like the sensation of being very confident about a card game and then watching the table change. "You," Holloway started, then stopped. He looked from Emily to Maddox and back. "You know this woman?" General Maddox didn't look at Holloway when he answered. "I know exactly who she is," he said. "The question I have for you, Mr. Holloway." And now he did turn, just slightly, the precise angular movement of a man who had been giving commands for 4 decades and had never once needed to raise his voice to be understood. "Is whether you do." The trauma bay alarm went off. Critical patient incoming. The intercom crackled with the paramedics' report. Polytrauma, 3 separate injury sites, blood pressure barely holding, ETA 90 seconds. Emily was already moving before the alarm finished. "General," she said, snapping on fresh gloves, "I have to go." "Go," he said, and then, "We'll be here." She went. She didn't look back at Holloway. She didn't need to. The patient coming in was a 32-year-old woman who had been in the 3rd car of the train when it left the tracks, and she was the 14th critical case of the evening, and she needed everything Emily had. Behind her in the corridor, she heard Holloway say something to one of his staff, something clipped and urgent, and she heard the federal agent respond, and she heard the general say nothing at all. She heard a door close. She heard boots on tile, following her toward the bay. The night wasn't over, not even close. The woman coming in was named Rosalind Mercer, and she was dying in the specific way that people die when multiple systems start failing at the same time. Not dramatically, not with any of the visual chaos that shows up in movies, but quietly and fast, the body just beginning to lose the argument it had been making with physics for the past 45 minutes. The paramedic gave the handoff report in the clipped, efficient shorthand of someone who had done this 1,000 times and was still running on adrenaline from this particular one. Blunt abdominal trauma, likely splenic laceration, GCS dropping from 15 to 12 en route, BP 78 over 48, 2 large bore IVs in, but the fluids weren't holding the pressure the way they should have been. Emily was already at the gurney before it cleared the bay entrance. Rosalind. She put her hand on the woman's forearm, not grabbing, just contact, something to anchor to. I'm Emily. You're at the hospital. Can you tell me if you have any allergies? Rosalind's eyes moved toward her. She was conscious, but the edges of it were starting to blur. No, she said. No allergies. Your kids are okay. We're taking care of you right now. She didn't know if the kids were okay. She said it anyway because Rosalind needed to stay with her, and fear for your children will pull you under faster than blood loss sometimes. Stay with me. Eyes on me. Rosalind stayed. Emily called for the ultrasound cart and ran a fast exam in under 2 minutes. Fluid in the abdomen, significant. The kind of picture that meant the spleen had done exactly what the paramedics suspected. She called for the surgical team simultaneously, gave the findings before she'd even finished the probe assessment, and when Dr. Okafor appeared at the bay entrance, Emily turned and gave her 30 seconds of the most important information in the most direct order possible. Okafor didn't argue. Okafor was good. Emily had decided that in the first 10 minutes of the evening, watching the way she moved between patients, the way she talked to her residents. What she lacked tonight wasn't skill, it was bandwidth. She was one attending covering more ground than 4 attending should cover, and the math was starting to show in small ways. A delayed decision here, a missed follow-up there, nothing catastrophic yet, but the kind of accumulation that got dangerous after hour 3. She needs the OR, Emily said. I know. Okafor was already pulling her phone out. We've got one room open. Farrell's in surgery. His resident is, get Farrell out. He needs to know about this patient. Okafor gave her a look. He's mid-procedure. He can hand off. This woman's pressure is not going to hold another 20 minutes. A beat. Then Okafor made the call. Rosalind went to surgery 9 minutes later. It was not a clean 9 minutes. There was a problem with the OR elevator, a brief equipment miscommunication, a moment where a nurse's aide tried to redirect the gurney to the wrong floor because the transit board hadn't been updated since the mass casualty protocol overwhelmed the administrative system. Emily walked the gurney herself from bay to elevator, talked to Rosalind the whole way, and handed her off to the surgical team on the 4th floor with a written summary that the scrub nurse said was the clearest handoff she'd received all night. She took the elevator back down alone. The doors opened, and General Maddox was standing in the corridor, not waiting for her specifically, or maybe he was. It was hard to tell with him. She'd found that true years ago, and it was apparently still true. He was looking at the trauma board on the wall, the running list of patients and statuses that the charge nurse updated every 15 minutes. His 2 aides were further down the hall. The federal agent, she'd caught a name by then, Reyes, from a badge glimpsed during the chaos of Rosalind's intake, was on a phone call near the exit. You remember how to run a ward, Maddox said. Not a question. I remember how to get through a night, Emily said. He looked at her then. Up close he looked older than she remembered, which was reasonable because she was also older than she remembered. There was something around his eyes that hadn't been there before. Not fatigue exactly, more like weight. The kind that accumulated when you'd been responsible for things that went wrong and things that went right, and sometimes couldn't tell the difference in the moment. How many critical cases tonight? He asked. 14 confirmed, possibly 2 more still incoming from the scene. She pulled off her gloves and grabbed a fresh pair from the dispenser on the wall. Where's Holloway? Administrator's conference room. He paused. With Agent Reyes. She let that sit for a moment. How long have you been building the case? She asked. He didn't answer immediately. That was an answer of its own. Long enough, he said. Your compliance report from 3 days ago. It connected something that had been disconnected. We'd been working a different angle. What angle? Federal billing fraud, 4 hospitals in the same regional network. He said it flatly, the way he said everything, not trying to make it sound bigger or smaller than it was. Meridian General was the smallest of the 4. It was also the only one where an internal employee had filed a formal report. Emily thought about the 47 billing codes, the procedures that hadn't happened. The patients who'd never received the care they'd been charged for. How many patients? She asked. Across all 4 facilities? We're still counting. He paused. It's not a small number. She looked down the corridor. The trauma bay was still moving, still loud, but the rhythm of it had changed. It was more controlled now, more organized. Delilah was running the secondary triage with the kind of focused competence that came from someone who'd been waiting their whole career for a situation that required everything they had. The residents were moving faster, making cleaner decisions. Even the equipment flow had smoothed out. Someone, probably one of the nurses, had reorganized the supply staging area so that the most used items were at the front and the retrieval time had dropped by maybe 40 seconds per case. 40 seconds per case, across 40 cases, was 26 minutes of saved time. In a mass casualty event, 26 minutes was the difference between outcomes that were acceptable and outcomes that were not. She hadn't explicitly told anyone to reorganize the supply staging. Someone had watched what was needed and done it. That happens sometimes. You created enough of a working environment, and the people inside it started solving problems you hadn't even gotten to yet. You came here tonight for the case, Emily said. Not for me. I came here tonight because the arrest warrants were ready and because your compliance report was the last piece we needed to go federal. He looked at her steadily. The fact that you were here was not something I planned for. But you knew I worked here. A pause. Yes. She let that go. There was too much else happening, and the conversation would still be there when the night was over. I need to get back, she said. Go, he said. Same word as before, same tone. She went. The next 90 minutes were the hardest of the evening. It wasn't that the cases got more severe, they didn't, not exactly. The worst of the train derailment victims had come in during the first wave, and the second wave was still serious but survivable in ways the first wave hadn't always been. What made the next 90 minutes difficult was accumulated strain, the kind that builds in a long-duration emergency when the adrenaline starts burning through its own supply, and the body starts sending invoices for all the shortcuts it's been making. A second-year resident named Torres made a medication error, not a catastrophic one. He caught it himself before administration, but he caught it because he'd been checking his own work twice on everything, which was itself a sign that he knew he was tired and didn't trust his margins. He reported it to Emily because she happened to be closest and because by this point the informal chain of command in the trauma wing had reorganized itself around whoever was making the fastest, accurate decisions, and that person was Emily. She didn't make a production of it. She corrected the order, confirmed the right dosage, and told Torres to drink some water and eat something if there was anything left in the break room. Is there? He asked. Probably crackers, she said. Maybe someone left a sad sandwich. He almost laughed. The almost was what mattered. She had her own wall around hour 2. It wasn't fatigue exactly. She'd run on less sleep in worse conditions. But there was a moment in the corridor between Bay 2 and the overflow area where she stopped walking and stood still for about 4 seconds for no reason she could have articulated. Just stopped. The noise of the department around her, the monitors and the voices and the PA system and the specific sound of wheels on tile went briefly abstract, and she stood in the middle of it like a fixed point. Then it passed. She kept moving. Dr. Lennox Farrell came out of surgery at 8:52 p.m. and found Emily in the corridor reviewing a patient chart. He was still in his surgical cap, his mask hanging loose around his neck. He was 57 years old and had the specific bearing of a man who'd spent 3 decades being the most important person in whatever room he was in. He looked at Emily, then at the chart, then at the organized, functioning, battle-weathered emergency department around her. "Who are you?" he said. "Emily Hayes. I was a nurse here until about 4 hours ago." His expression did something complicated. "Okafor told me what you've been doing tonight. Okafor's been carrying this department. I just helped with traffic." "That's not what she said." He looked down the corridor. "Rosalind Mercer is out of surgery. She's stable." Emily closed the chart. "Good. You called it exactly right on the timing. We had maybe a 10-minute window before that bleed would have..." He stopped. "I'm saying you called it right." "Okay." He looked at her for a moment. There was something working behind his eyes that she recognized as the specific discomfort of a man who was good at his job revising his understanding of a situation. He'd walked past her 3 times earlier in the evening, once near the supply staging area, twice near the nurses' station, and hadn't stopped to ask who she was or what she was doing. He was putting that together now. "I heard there are federal agents in the building," he said. "Yes. And a general." "Yes." He waited, as if she might say more. She didn't. He nodded, slowly, and went back toward the OR wing. Sophia's mother had been found. Marcus had tracked her through the intake log. She'd come in on the second transport with a broken collarbone and a concussion, conscious throughout, and had been asking about her daughter since the moment she arrived. Someone had finally connected them at 8:15, and Emily had passed the room where Sophia was sitting with her mother. Sophia with her arm in a temporary splint, her mother with a cervical collar and an IV, both of them holding each other's free hand. And she'd kept walking because there was nothing she needed to add to that picture. It was the only moment of the evening where something in her chest did something she didn't have immediate vocabulary for. She kept walking. At 9:34 p.m., Grant Holloway came back to the emergency department. He didn't come alone. He had the hospital's legal counsel with him, a woman named Petra Voss, whom Emily knew by reputation, sharp and fast and deeply committed to whatever outcome was best for her client, which tonight had to be making this situation look like a misunderstanding. He also had 2 members of the hospital's board, both of whom looked like they'd been pulled from dinner reservations and were still processing exactly how bad this was going to get. Emily was updating the patient board when she heard his voice. "This department is still under my administrative authority," Holloway said. He was projecting the boardroom voice again, but it had a crack in it now. Something slightly too effortful, like a man pressing his full weight on a surface he'd just discovered wasn't solid. "Any personnel operating without proper credentials need to be removed immediately, regardless of Mr. Holloway." Agent Reyes materialized from the direction of the administrative corridor. He had the particular quality of federal agents who'd been doing this long enough that nothing surprised them, which expressed itself as a kind of unnerving calm. "I need to ask you to return to the conference room. I'm not under any obligation to—" "You are, actually." Reyes didn't say it loudly. He didn't need to. The oversight order was filed at 7:40 this evening. It covers administrative operations of this facility pending federal review. If you'd like to discuss the specifics, we can do that in the conference room. Holloway looked at Voss. Voss looked at the floor for a half-second, the kind of half-second that meant she'd already read the order and already knew what it said, and then looked back up with a professional expression that gave away nothing except that she was already thinking about what came next. "Grant," Voss said quietly. "Conference room." Holloway stood there. Emily was still updating the board, her back half turned to the scene, writing patient names and status codes and bed assignments in the specific shorthand that the department used. She wasn't performing indifference. She genuinely had more important things to do than watch Grant Holloway be walked back down a corridor, but she heard him in the moment before he turned to go. She heard the way his breathing changed, the specific sound of a man understanding, maybe for the first time, that the ground had shifted and he hadn't noticed until it was under his feet. She kept writing. Delilah appeared at her shoulder. 12 patients cleared and discharged, she said, looking at the board. 6 still active, 2 in surgery. The waiting room situation is basically under control. County sent us 3 additional triage nurses at 9 o'clock. Good, Emily added the last notation. What about the boarding backlog? We had 8 patients waiting for beds before the derailment started. Still waiting. The floor supervisor says she can clear 2 more rooms by 10. Push for 3. The overflow positions need to be freed up for anything still incoming. Delilah looked at her. Not with irritation, yet something more like assessment. You know you're technically not supposed to be giving me orders. I know. I'm going to follow them anyway. I know that too. Delilah almost smiled. It was the same almost as Torres's almost laugh. Something that would have been a full expression under different circumstances, muted by the particular exhaustion of people who had been running at maximum output for 4 hours and hadn't let themselves feel it yet. A movement at the far end of the corridor caught Emily's eye. General Maddox was walking toward the trauma bay with the federal agent beside him. That wasn't unusual. Maddox had been moving through the building all evening, observing, talking to his aides, occasionally talking to Reyes with the focused brevity of men who'd worked together long enough to compress an entire conversation into 30 words. What was unusual was the woman walking with them. Emily didn't recognize her immediately. Then the light shifted, and she did. Dr. Margot Klein, Regional Director of the Healthcare Integrity Division, Federal Office of Inspector General. Emily had never met her in person, but she'd seen her name on compliance reporting documents, and she'd seen her face in a news segment about a regional hospital fraud investigation that had run about 14 months ago. Klein was here, which meant this wasn't just federal agents with an arrest warrant. This was a formal investigation operation, the kind that required institutional oversight at the highest level of the relevant regulatory authority. Emily set down the marker she'd been using on the board. The scope of what Holloway had done, what he'd been doing, was apparently considerably larger than 47 fraudulent billing codes. Maddox caught her eye from across the corridor. He gave her a single small nod. She nodded back. And then one of the surgical floor nurses came running down the corridor, which was never a good sign, and whatever Emily had been about to think about Margot Klein and federal investigations and the full shape of what was unraveling inside this building went away entirely because the running nurse was saying something about the patient in Recovery Bay 1. And Recovery Bay 1 was where Arthur had gone after surgery, and Arthur was the retired electrician who'd been on his way to his granddaughter's piano recital. Emily was moving before the nurse finished the sentence. Arthur's blood pressure had dropped. Not the catastrophic crash of a bleed, but the slower, more confusing drop that sometimes happened post-surgery when the body's inflammatory response did something unexpected, and the recovery team had caught it and responded correctly, but had also called for backup because one of the monitors was giving inconsistent readings, and nobody was entirely sure if the inconsistency was the monitor or the patient. Emily assessed him in 3 minutes. It was the monitor, a calibration error in the arterial line transducer, the kind of equipment problem that happened more frequently in facilities where maintenance logs weren't current, which was a detail she noticed and filed away without saying anything about it. "He's okay," she told the recovery nurse. "Reposition the transducer and re-zero. Actual pressure is probably closer to 102/68. Check again in 5 minutes." The nurse repositioned. The number changed. Arthur's actual pressure was 104/70. Arthur himself was awake, groggy, looking at the ceiling with the expression of a man who'd just been through something significant and hadn't fully processed it yet. "Granddaughter," he said, when he noticed Emily. "She's waiting," Emily said. She had no idea if this was true. "How do you feel?" "Like I got hit by a train." "You did, sort of." "That's not comforting." "It wasn't supposed to be. It's just accurate." She checked his IV rate, checked the surgical dressing, checked his temp. Everything within acceptable range. "You did well tonight, Arthur." "I didn't do anything," he said. "You people did everything." She didn't answer that. She wrote her assessment on his chart and told the recovery nurse to contact her if the pressure moved again and went back to the corridor. It was 10:08 p.m. The emergency department was quieter now. Not quiet. Never fully quiet after a night like this. But the acute crisis pitch had dropped to something more like a sustained working hum. Patients were being moved, discharged, transferred. The waiting room had thinned. The supply staging area was still organized the way the unnamed nurse had organized it hours ago, and it was still working. Emily stood in the corridor for a moment. Down at the far end, the door to the administrative conference room opened. She heard voices, not words, but the cadence of something official, and not going well for at least one of the people in the room. Then the door closed again. Her phone, her personal phone, which she still had because nobody had thought to ask for it during the termination, buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out. Unknown number. Area code she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer it. She answered it. "Ms. Hayes?" The voice on the other end was a woman's, professional, measured. "My name is Dr. Klein. I'm in the building. I wonder if you'd be willing to speak with me before the end of the evening." Emily looked down the corridor toward the conference room. "About what?" she said. A brief pause. about what you found in the billing records, and about what else you may have seen in your time here that you haven't yet had the opportunity to report. Emily's hand tightened slightly on the phone, because there was something else. There had been something else for 11 days, something she'd found 2 weeks before the billing codes, something she hadn't put in the compliance report because she hadn't been sure yet, hadn't had enough documentation, had been building towards certainty when Holloway had fired her and the evening had swallowed everything else. Something about a patient, a specific patient, a transfer that had happened 6 weeks ago that shouldn't have happened, to a facility that didn't have the right resources, and the patient had died 4 days after the transfer, and the record of who had authorized the transfer had been altered in the system. She hadn't been sure. She'd been building toward sure. "Yes," Emily said. "I'll speak with you." She hung up. She stood in the corridor for 3 more seconds. Then from the administrative wing she heard it. Not words, not voices. Just the specific sound of a door opening and footsteps that were different from all the other footsteps in the building tonight. Multiple people. Moving with purpose. Moving fast. And then she heard Grant Holloway's voice, no longer controlled, no longer boardroom smooth, cracked open into something she'd never heard from him before. Something raw and loud, and suddenly, finally, frightened. The sound of Holloway's voice cracking open like that, unguarded, suddenly stripped of every layer of management polish he'd spent 20 years building, moved through the corridor and hit Emily somewhere below the sternum. Not satisfaction. Not exactly. Something more complicated than that. The specific feeling of a thing you'd been certain was wrong, finally being confirmed as wrong, which should have been simple, but never was. She walked toward the administrative wing. She wasn't running. There was no clinical reason to run. No patient alarm, no code, nothing that required her physically anywhere in the next 30 seconds. She walked at the pace she used when she needed to cover ground without announcing herself, the pace she'd learned in places where announcing yourself was a tactical error. The conference room door was open. Holloway was standing near the far wall, not against it exactly, but close, the body language of a man who'd run out of room to retreat. His legal counsel, Petra Voss, was beside him, with a face that had gone professionally neutral in the way faces go neutral when the situation has moved past advocacy into damage containment. The 2 board members were seated at the table, both very still, both looking at Agent Reyes with the expression of people trying to calculate exactly how much trouble they were in and finding the number too large to hold. Dr. Klein was standing near the window with a tablet in her hand. She was shorter than Emily had expected from the news segment. Maybe 5'2", gray-streaked hair pulled back, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She looked up when Emily appeared in the doorway. "Ms. Hayes," she said. "Thank you for coming." Reyes turned. Maddox, standing near the door on the other side, turned. Holloway turned last. His face when he saw her was something she wouldn't have been able to describe accurately if someone had asked her later. It wasn't anger anymore, say. Anger had been the first thing, and then there'd been the controlled boardroom management of it, and then the crack she'd heard in the corridor. What was on his face now was something older and less strategic. Recognition, maybe. The specific recognition of a man seeing the thread that unraveled everything. "Ms. Hayes," Reyes said, "we were about to ask Mr. Holloway about a patient transfer authorization dated 6 weeks ago. We understand you may have relevant information." She looked at Holloway when she answered. "I do." Voss put her hand on Holloway's arm. He didn't move. "The patient's name was Raymond Cho," Emily said. 64 years old. He was admitted through this ER with acute respiratory failure secondary to a chronic condition. He was stabilized over 48 hours. On day 3 of his admission, he was transferred to Eastfield Care Pavilion. She paused. The room was very still. "Eastfield doesn't have a pulmonary critical care unit," she said. "It doesn't have the monitoring capacity for a patient with Raymond Cho's profile. It does, however, have a significantly lower per-day billing rate than Meridian General, and it has a financial relationship with the same management company that holds a controlling interest in this hospital's parent organization." Klein was looking at her tablet. The transfer authorization in the system lists Dr. Farrell as the authorizing physician. Dr. Farrell didn't authorize it. Emily had been building toward this certainty for 11 days. She was certain now. The original record listed a different physician. The record was altered. I noticed the discrepancy in the system timestamp. The authorization was backdated, but the metadata didn't match. I have screenshots. She had them on her phone. She'd taken them 9 days ago and sent them to her personal email as a backup. Old habit, that one. In environments where information had a way of disappearing, you kept copies somewhere that didn't belong to the institution that might want it gone. She pulled out her phone. She pulled up the screenshots. She handed the phone to Reyes. Reyes looked at them. Then he looked at Klein. Something passed between them that wasn't words. Raymond Cho died 4 days after the transfer, Emily said. Eastfield's incident report attributed it to disease progression. His family was told it was expected given his condition. Voss said quietly, Grant. Holloway said nothing. Was it expected? Klein asked. Not according to his chart when he left this facility, Emily said. He was declining, but he was being managed. The transfer interrupted the management. She stopped. He had a daughter. She called the nursing station twice after the transfer to ask why her father had been moved. Someone told her the move was medically indicated. The room was quiet for a long moment. Then Holloway said, I want my attorney. Voss said, I am your attorney. A different one. Reyes said, You have that right, Mr. Holloway. We'll take a break. He handed Emily's phone back to her. Ms. Hayes, I'd like to get a formal statement from you tonight if you're willing. I'm willing, she said. She turned to go. General Maddox was still near the door and he stepped aside to let her pass, but as she moved past him, he said her name quietly, the way he said everything. She stopped. The screenshot, he said. You took that 9 days ago. Yes. Before you filed the compliance report. Yes. Why didn't you include it in the report? She thought about how to answer that. Because I wasn't done yet, she said. I needed more. I didn't want to make a claim I couldn't fully back up. Raymond Cho's family deserved more than a claim. Maddox looked at her for a moment. He nodded once, slowly. She went back to the corridor. The emergency department had reached the hour of an emergency that most people never saw, the institutional aftermath. The acute crisis was over. The patients were accounted for, treated, or transferred or discharged. The count on the whiteboard in Delilah's careful handwriting adding up to a night that had processed 43 trauma cases in 6 hours with no fatalities in the department itself. That number was not an accident. It was the accumulated result of 1,000 small decisions made correctly under pressure, and most of the people who'd made those decisions were now standing in the corridor or the break room or the supply room, looking like they'd just surfaced from underwater. Torres, the second-year resident, was sitting on the floor next to the nurse's station, eating crackers from a small package with the specific focused intensity of someone whose body had just presented its invoice for the night. He looked up when Emily walked by. You eat anything? He asked. Not yet. He held out the crackers. She took 2. Thanks. You're the one who saved my ass with that medication catch. You caught it yourself. Because I was double-checking everything because of something you said earlier. She ate the crackers. They were the plain kind, slightly stale. What did I say? He thought about it. You didn't say anything directly. The way you moved through this department tonight made everyone around you slower and more careful. Like we couldn't afford to be sloppy because you weren't being sloppy. He paused. I'm not explaining that well. You're explaining it fine. She handed the crackers back. Get off the floor before your back hates you. He stood up slowly. Who are you, actually? She looked at him. Emily Hayes? I used to work here. Used to. Since about 4 this afternoon. He absorbed this. And before here? She didn't answer that. He seemed to understand that not answering was its own answer, because he nodded and didn't push. Dr. Okafor found her 10 minutes later in the supply room where Emily was recounting the portable defibrillator charges because someone needed to and because she needed somewhere to stand that wasn't the middle of the corridor. Okafor leaned in the doorway. She looked exhausted in a precise, specific way. Not beaten, just fully used. Final count, Okafor said. 43 cases, 6 surgeries, 0 deaths in department. Arthur's stable, Emily said. I know, I checked. Okafor paused. Rosalind Mercer came out of surgery talking. She asked about the nurse who talked to her during intake. I told her I'd pass it on. Emily set down the defibrillator. How are your residents? Tired. Better than they should be for a night like this. She was quiet for a moment. I've been in attending for 6 years. Never seen a department organized the way this one organized tonight. Emily didn't say anything. I should have said something when he fired you, Okafor said. You had 14 critical patients. That's not why I didn't say something. Emily looked at her. Okafor's face was doing the same complicated thing Farrell's had done earlier, but Okafor's version was more honest about what it was. Not just revision, but accountability. The specific face of a person owning something they'd rather not own. I told myself it wasn't my business, Okafor said. That's what I told myself. I know. Was it? She stopped. Did I make it harder for you? Standing there and not saying anything? Emily thought about the moment. The badge on the floor. 11 people watching. The specific quality of a room full of people who knew something was wrong and calculated that it wasn't worth the cost to say so. Yes, she said. A little. Okafor accepted that. Okay, she said. She didn't apologize, which Emily respected more than if she had, because an apology would have been for Okafor's comfort, not Emily's. Then I'm sorry, specifically for that. Okay, Emily said. Okafor pushed off the doorframe. The board members are in the conference room with the federal people. Someone from hospital PR called my personal cell 20 minutes ago to ask if I'd make a statement attributing tonight's outcome to the hospital's robust emergency response protocols. She said this with the specific flatness of a woman who had used up her tolerance for institutional nonsense sometime around hour 2. I told her I'd think about it. What are you going to tell her? Okafor smiled, thin and tired and exact. I'm going to tell her that the hospital's robust emergency response protocols were performed by a nurse who got fired 4 hours before the disaster started. She paused. After I sleep. She left. Emily stood in the supply room for another minute. Then she heard voices from the direction of the main entrance. Not the administrative wing, not the corridor, but the lobby. Multiple voices, outdoor sound bleeding in through the automatic doors, which meant the doors were opening and closing. She walked toward the lobby. The media had arrived. Not just one outlet. 4 vehicles with different logos, camera operators setting up on the sidewalk in front of the hospital entrance, a reporter doing a stand-up with the building's facade lit behind her by portable lights. Someone in the lobby, one of the administrative staff, a young woman Emily didn't know, was standing near the reception desk looking at her phone with an expression that said the coverage was already live. Emily stopped inside the lobby doors. Maddox was there. He'd moved from the administrative wing at some point in the last 30 minutes, and he was standing near the lobby windows with his aides, watching the media set up outside with the expression of a man who was not surprised and was already deciding something. They know, Emily said. Someone called it in during the arrest, he said. That happens. Holloway's been arrested? He turned. 20 minutes ago, Reyes processed the warrant. He paused. The board members are cooperating. That changes the timeline considerably. She looked out at the cameras. One of the reporters was gesturing toward the building, saying something to her camera operator. The footage was probably already cut. The helicopters, the federal vehicles, the timeline of the evening. These things told their own story without any quotes. What happens now? She asked. Now there are statements, he said. Federal investigators, hospital board. The narrative matters at this stage. Whose narrative? He looked at her. That's actually what I need to talk to you about. There was something in his voice she recognized from years ago. Not discomfort. Maddox didn't do discomfort in any visible way, but the particular quality his voice got when he was about to say something he'd thought about carefully and was choosing his words with that care. There's going to be significant public attention on this case, he said. The billing fraud, the patient transfer, Raymond Cho. These are the kind of details that become news cycles, and you are, whether you intended it or not, the person at the center of them. I filed a compliance report, she said. That's all. You filed a compliance report You were terminated in front of 11 witnesses, and then you ran the emergency response for a 43-case mass casualty event while the CEO of this facility was being arrested by federal agents. He paused. That's a story, Lieutenant, whether you want it to be or not. She looked at the reporters outside. One of them had moved closer to the entrance. The lobby doors were automatic, and they kept cycling open slightly and then closing, a brief flash of cold air each time. I don't want to be a story, she said. I know. He said it without judgment. But Raymond Cho's daughter deserves one. That landed somewhere it was supposed to land. She was quiet for a moment. What are you asking me? I'm not asking you anything. He turned back toward the window. I'm telling you that when Dr. Klein makes her statement tonight, your name is going to be in it. Because the compliance report is part of the public record now, and the public record is going to matter for the families, for Raymond Cho's family, for every patient billed for procedures they never received. He paused. I wanted you to hear it from me first. She heard the lobby doors open, not the automatic cycling this time, a deliberate push, and turned. Dr. Klein walked in, followed by Reyes and two other people Emily didn't know. Klein looked at Emily and gave her a nod that communicated a great deal in a small motion. We're ready to make a statement outside, Klein said. Ms. Hayes, I'd like you present. You don't have to speak, but I think it matters that you're visible. Emily looked at her. Raymond Cho's family has been contacted, Klein said. His daughter asked one question. A brief pause. She asked if anyone had tried to stop it. The lobby was quiet. Someone had, Klein said. I'd like her to be able to see that person. Emily looked at the doors, at the cameras outside, the bright portable lights, the reporters waiting for the story to give them a shape to put on the air. She looked at Maddox, who was watching her with nothing on his face except patience. She was tired. Her feet had been sending complaints for 2 hours that she'd been ignoring. There was a pulled muscle in her left shoulder from the positioning work on the spinal patient that she'd also been ignoring. She hadn't eaten anything except 2 stale crackers and a cup of coffee she'd had at 5 p.m. before any of this had started. She thought about Raymond Cho, whom she'd never met, who had been 64 years old and managing a chronic condition and had been transferred to a facility that couldn't keep him alive because that transfer was financially convenient for a man who is currently in federal custody. She thought about his daughter calling the nursing station and being told the move was medically indicated. Okay, she said. The statement lasted 12 minutes. Klein spoke first. The federal framework, the scope of the investigation, the specific violations. She was precise and thorough and gave the reporters exactly enough to run with while not compromising the ongoing case. Reyes stood behind her. Behind Reyes, 2 of his team. Behind them, without being asked and without being staged, General Maddox. Emily stood slightly to the side. She had not expected the cameras to find her as quickly as they did. The reporter who'd been doing the stand-up near the entrance, young, quick, the kind of reporter who was working harder than the job technically required of her at this stage of her career, had noticed Emily's positioning relative to Maddox and Klein, and her eyes had moved between the 3 of them with the particular speed of someone assembling a picture that's more interesting than the official one. Can you tell us the name of the nurse who filed the original compliance report? The reporter called out, during a pause in Klein's statement. Klein glanced at Emily, a question in it. Emily gave a very small nod. Her name is Emily Hayes, Klein said. She was a nurse in this facility's emergency department. She identified the billing irregularities, she documented them, she filed a formal report through proper channels, and she was terminated in response. She said it cleanly, without editorial. The facts were editorial enough. Tonight, during a mass casualty event triggered by the Junction Street train derailment, Ms. Hayes returned to this facility as a volunteer and provided emergency clinical leadership that contributed directly to a 0 fatality outcome in the department. The cameras moved. Emily looked into the nearest lens for approximately 1 second, and then looked slightly past it, which was a habit from other contexts where you didn't let your eyes settle on a fixed point when things might require sudden movement. Old training dying slowly. The reporter was already asking a follow-up question about her background, and Klein was giving a measured non-answer that was technically accurate, and told the reporter nothing specific. And Emily was standing in front of a hospital she no longer worked at, while the night air came in cold off the street and the lights were very bright. Then General Maddox stepped forward. He stepped forward without being asked, without it being part of any planned statement, in the specific way that Maddox did things when he had decided they needed to be done. He stepped up beside Klein, and the reporters went very still, because 4 stars in dress uniform at 10:30 p.m. in front of a hospital with federal vehicles in the parking lot was the kind of image that rewrote whatever story you thought you were covering. "I'll add one thing," he said. He said it without a microphone. His voice carried anyway. Emily Hayes served as an Army combat nurse for 6 years. She deployed 3 times. In her final deployment, she managed a mass casualty event under direct fire that resulted in 0 fatalities among 14 critically wounded Special Operations personnel. He paused. She was awarded the Army Commendation Medal with Valor Device for that action. She left the service quietly and went to work in a civilian hospital, where she was terminated for doing exactly what her training, her integrity, and her obligation to her patients required of her. Another pause. "I've been doing this for 38 years. I know what courage looks like. It doesn't always look the way people expect." The cameras were completely still. Somewhere behind Emily, the lobby doors opened and she heard footsteps. Hospital staff coming to the entrance, drawn by the statement, drawn by the light. She didn't turn to look. She kept her eyes slightly past the nearest camera and her hands at her sides and her face doing what it did under pressure. Still, like a lake surface. Then one of Maddox's aides said something into his earpiece, and Maddox turned to Emily, and whatever the aide had said, it had pulled the calm off Maddox's face and replaced it with something sharp. "Inside," he said quietly. "Now." She followed him without asking why. They were back through the lobby doors before the reporters had fully processed the shift, and Reyes was already on his phone, and Klein had turned away from the cameras, and someone from the federal team was moving fast toward the administrative wing. "What happened?" Emily said. Maddox said, "One of the board members, he made a call from the conference room during the break." She understood immediately. "Who did he call?" "We're working on that." Reyes beside them now, phone still in hand. "But whoever he called had time to access the record system. Someone has been in the hospital's billing database in the last 20 minutes. Emily stopped walking. "Which records?" she said. Reyes looked at her. "The ones related to Raymond Cho." She felt something go cold and precise in the center of her chest. "The screenshots I gave you," she said. "The metadata evidence. Still intact, we have copies." Reyes was already pulling his radio. "But the original system record, the one with the discrepancy in the timestamp, has been modified." Emily stared at him. "Someone inside this building," he said, "with system access, changed the record in the last 20 minutes. The hospital was still full of people. Staff, patients, families, federal agents, 2 of Maddox's aides, the media outside, and somewhere inside it, someone who had just destroyed evidence in an active federal investigation. Not panicking, not fleeing, but still here, still in the building." Reyes said, "We need to know who else had access to that record. Who, besides Holloway, would have known exactly which file to modify." Emily's mind was already moving. She knew this hospital. She'd worked in it for 14 months. She knew its staffing structure, its administrative hierarchy, its system access levels. She knew who had billing database credentials and who didn't. She knew from 11 days of quiet documentation exactly which names appeared in the audit trail of Raymond Cho's file before it was altered the first time. She knew who it was. She looked at Reyes. She looked at Maddox. "I know who modified that record," she said. And from somewhere deeper in the building, an alarm went off. Not a patient alarm, not the emergency channel. The security alarm. The kind that triggered when an exterior door was opened from the inside without a badge. Someone was running. The security alarm was still cycling when Emily started moving, not toward the administrative wing, not toward the lobby. She went left, down the corridor that ran behind the nursing station, because she knew this building and she knew that the exterior door the alarm had flagged was the one at the end of the East Service corridor, the door that the maintenance staff used for equipment transfers, the one that bypassed the main security desk entirely and led out onto the narrow access road that ran behind the facility's parking structure. She knew this because 14 months of night shifts will teach you every door in a building. You learn exits the way you learn supply locations and backup protocols. Not because you're told to, but because the shape of a place becomes part of you when you spend enough hours inside it. Reyes was already radioing his team. Maddox was 2 steps behind Emily before she'd gone 10 feet, which told her he'd processed the situation faster than most people half his age would have. "East service door," she said, not slowing. "It opens onto the access road behind the parking structure. If they have a vehicle back there, they have maybe a 90-second lead." "Name," Maddox said. "Dennis Ray. He's the hospital's director of finance. He's had billing system administrator access for 4 years. His name is in the original audit trail on Raymond Cho's record, not as the person who authorized the transfer, but as the person who accessed the record twice in the week after the transfer." She turned the corner into the east corridor. "When I was building the documentation, I couldn't prove he'd modified anything yet. I just knew he'd been in the file at times that didn't make sense for his role. You didn't include him in the compliance report." "I didn't have enough." The door at the end of the corridor was closed, the alarm light above it flashing red. "Now I do." She pushed the door open. The access road was poorly lit. 2 overhead fixtures, one of which had been flickering for weeks, a maintenance request that had never been fulfilled. She'd noted it on a facilities report 2 months ago, and nothing had happened, which was the kind of institutional neglect that built up quietly until it mattered. Tonight it mattered. The road was empty. She stepped outside. Cold air, the specific cold of a city night in early spring when the warmth of the day had been fully canceled out. The parking structure was to her right, a gray concrete mass with the entrance ramp visible on the far side. To her left, the road curved around the building's service entrance and connected to the street behind the hospital. She heard it before she saw it. An engine, already moving, headlights off. A gray sedan pulling away from the far end of the access road at a speed that was fast but not panicked. The speed of someone who'd thought through the exit in advance. "He had a plan," she said. Maddox was beside her, looking at the retreating vehicle. "License plate." She caught the last 3 characters before it turned onto the street. She said them aloud. Maddox relayed them to Reyes on the radio without delay. "He's not going to get far," Maddox said. "He doesn't need to get far," Emily said. "He needs to get to wherever the backup is." Maddox looked at her. "He modified the record tonight," she said. "Which means whatever was in that record, whatever the original showed before Holloway's team first altered it, was something that led back to Ray specifically, not just Holloway. If the only copy was in the hospital system and he's deleted or changed it, then the direct link between him and Raymond Cho's death is gone." She paused. "Unless someone else has a copy." She pulled out her phone. She had the screenshots from 9 days ago. The metadata discrepancy, the timestamp. But those showed the record as it existed 9 days ago, after Holloway's team had already made their first modification. They showed the backdating. What they didn't clearly show was the original authorization, the original name. She thought about this. She thought about it fast. "Dr. Klein," she said, "when did federal investigators first access Meridian General's records?" Maddox got Klein on the radio in under a minute. The answer came back in under 2. 72 hours ago, Maddox said. Emily let out a breath. "Then they have a snapshot," she said. "If federal investigators pulled the record 72 hours ago, they have a copy of the database as it existed at that point. Whatever Ray just changed, the federal copy predates the modification." Maddox stared at her for a moment, then quietly. "He just destroyed evidence that federal investigators already have." "Yes," she said. "He ran, and the evidence is still intact." She went back inside. The next 20 minutes reorganized everything. Reyes confirmed the federal database snapshot within 8 minutes of Emily's call. The copy pulled 72 hours ago contained Raymond Cho's record in its pre-Ray state, and in that state, the authorization for the transfer carried not Dr. Farrell's name, but a different name entirely. A physician who had left Meridian General's staff 9 months ago under circumstances that the HR file described as voluntary resignation and that the federal snapshot suggested were considerably less voluntary. The physician's name was Marcus Teal, and his credentials had been used, Without his knowledge, investigators would later determine, using a saved login that had never been deactivated after his departure, to authorize Raymond Cho's transfer. The use of his credentials created a layer of distance between the order and the people who'd given it. If the evidence held, it would connect Holloway and Ray directly to a decision that had resulted in a patient's death. Emily heard this from Klein, who came to find her in the East Corridor at 10:47 p.m. with the particular expression of a person who has just confirmed something they'd suspected and is now managing the implications. The record Ray modified tonight actually made things worse for him, Klein said. He changed the wrong field. He overwrote the attending physician notation, but he didn't touch the access log. His own credentials are in the access log for tonight's session. He panicked, Emily said. He panicked, Klein confirmed. People with something to hide often modify their own record of the situation rather than the evidence itself. It's a particular kind of tunnel vision. Emily thought about Holloway standing in the ER entrance, telling her she didn't work here anymore, while 43 patients were about to come through the door. Same species of tunnel vision. The certainty that the institution was the thing that mattered, the paperwork, the authority structure. And everything outside it was noise. Has he been picked up? Emily asked. County sheriffs intercepted the vehicle on Kettner Boulevard. Klein said it without inflection. He didn't resist. He asked for his lawyer before the officer had finished identifying himself. Emily nodded. Klein looked at her steadily. I want to ask you something. Okay. How long did you know it was Ray? I suspected him for about a week, Emily said. I knew, specifically, when Reyes told me the record had been modified tonight, because the only person who would modify that record at that specific moment, during the break in the conference room session, when Holloway was lawyering up and the board members were scared, was someone who understood exactly what was in it and exactly what it proved. And you'd been building toward that proof for 11 days. I'd been building toward certainty, Emily said. There's a difference. Klein was quiet for a moment. You could have gone to the media. With what you had, even before the compliance report, you could have gone external. I could have, Emily said. It would have been faster. She paused. It would also have given them time to destroy things before any investigators were involved. If I went public first, whatever was in the system would have been gone within hours. So you went through channels. I went through channels. She said it without bitterness, which was harder than it sounded given that going through channels had resulted in being fired in front of 11 colleagues. Because channels existed for a reason. Because I wanted there to be something left when investigators got here. Klein looked at her for another long moment. Then she said, Raymond Cho's daughter is named Patricia. She's 41, she lives in the Westridge district, and she found out tonight what actually happened to her father. A pause. She asked to speak with you, not with me, not with the federal team, with you, specifically. Emily stood in the East Corridor with the service door behind her and the flickering overhead fixture casting everything in slightly uneven light, and said nothing for a moment. Give me her number, she said. Except, she found an empty exam room on the second floor and sat on the edge of the exam table and called Patricia Cho at 11:03 p.m. The call lasted 9 minutes. Emily would remember almost none of it with any precision. It wasn't the kind of conversation that arranged itself neatly in memory. What she remembered was Patricia's voice, which was the voice of a woman who'd been crying and had stopped and was now in that exhausted place on the other side of crying, where everything was very flat and very clear. She remembered that Patricia said her father had called her from the hospital the night before the transfer and told her he was doing better. She remembered that Patricia had believed the transfer was appropriate because she'd had no reason not to. She remembered that Patricia said, at some point near the end, I just needed to know someone tried. Someone tried, Emily said. I'm sorry I wasn't faster. You didn't know him, Patricia said. No. But you still... She stopped. Thank you. I don't know what else to say. Just thank you. Emily sat on the edge of the exam table after the call ended and looked at the wall across from her, which had a blood pressure cuff mounted on it and a poster about hand hygiene and nothing else. She sat there for approximately 2 minutes and did not think about anything in particular, which was its own kind of processing. Then she got up because there was still work. Oh, The hospital at midnight had a different quality than the hospital at 10 p.m. The derailment patients were settled in rooms, in recovery, discharged home, or in the specific suspended state of post-surgical rest that would last through the night and into morning. The trauma bay had been cleaned, restocked, and reset by a team of nurses who'd been working since 7 a.m. and hadn't stopped. Delilah had gone home at 11:30 after giving a handoff report to the night supervisor that was, by multiple accounts, the most thorough and well-organized handoff report anyone in the department had ever heard. The whiteboard in the secondary triage area still had some of her handwriting on it. Torres had gone home. Dr. Okafor had gone home after finishing 3 hours of documentation. Dr. Farrell was somewhere in the surgical wing dealing with his own aftermath, specifically the discovery that his credentials had been used without his knowledge on a patient transfer, which was a conversation he was apparently having with Rhea's team that was not going smoothly because Farrell had a great deal to say about it and expressed his opinions at considerable volume. Emily was still in the building. She was in the lobby, sitting in one of the chairs near the window, drinking bad coffee from the vending machine on the second floor and watching the media vehicles outside begin to pack up. One remained. The reporter who'd asked about the compliance report, whose name Emily had caught from her press credentials as Salome Varga. Varga was still on the sidewalk, talking to someone on the phone, notebook in hand, moving around in the way reporters moved when they had more story than they knew what to do with yet. General Maddox sat down in the chair beside Emily. He hadn't left either. She hadn't expected him to, exactly. He was the kind of man who stayed until a thing was finished, and this thing wasn't finished yet. It probably wouldn't be finished for months. The investigation would go on, the prosecutorial process would go on, the full scope of the billing fraud across all 4 facilities in the network would take federal investigators the better part of a year to map completely. But tonight had its own finishing point, and they hadn't reached it yet. "Ray's in custody," Maddox said. "I know." She'd heard from Reyes 20 minutes ago. His lawyer is claiming he modified the record in response to what he described as procedural confusion during the federal review and that it wasn't intentional evidence tampering. His lawyer is going to have a difficult time with that argument, Emily said. His lawyer seems to know that. He paused. Holloway's counsel has already opened discussions about cooperation. They want to know what the sentencing differential looks like if he provides full documentation of the financial relationship between Meridian General and the management company. She thought about what that meant for the other 3 hospitals in the network. For whatever patients at those facilities had also been billed for procedures they never received. For whatever transfers had happened elsewhere. "He'll cooperate," she said. "He's calculating. He's been calculating since the moment you walked into the building." She sipped the coffee. It was bad in the specific way that vending machine coffee was bad when it had been in the machine too long. "He calculated wrong, but he'll keep calculating." "That's useful to us," Maddox said. "His calculations at this point work in the investigation's favor." She looked at him. "Why are you still here?" He seemed slightly surprised by the question, which was unusual for Maddox. "I told you, the narrative matters. The statement's been made. Klein's got what she needs for tonight." She set down the coffee. "You have 3 Blackhawks in a field across the street." "I'm aware." "Why are you still here?" He was quiet for a moment, long enough that she stopped expecting him to answer. "Because I read your compliance report when Reyes sent it to me," he said. 3 days ago, 2 pages. Everything documented, everything sourced, everything cross-referenced. The kind of report that someone writes when they already know nobody's going to listen." He paused. "I've read a lot of reports in 38 years. Most people who know nobody's listening stop writing clearly. They get frustrated or scared, and the report gets messy. Yours was the clearest 2 pages I've read in a long time." She looked at the window. At Salome Varga outside, still on the phone. "I didn't know nobody was listening," Emily said. "I hope someone was." "Someone was," Maddox said. She nodded. The lobby was quiet around them. The overnight security guard at the desk, the distant sound of the hospital's upper floors doing their nighttime business, the occasional soft announcement from the PA system. "I need to sleep," she said. "Eventually." "Eventually," he agreed. She stood up. She picked up the bad coffee. She looked at the lobby. The space where, 7 hours ago, Grant Holloway had stripped her badge from her lanyard and the plastic had hit the floor and nobody had moved. The badge was gone. Someone had picked it up at some point. She didn't know when. She went to find Reyes because her formal statement still needed to be given, and she wanted it done tonight while everything was precise and intact. She was halfway across the lobby when the main doors opened and Salome Varga walked in, notebook in hand, with the expression of a reporter who had made a decision about which version of the story she was going to pursue. "Ms. Hayes," Varga said, "I'm sorry to catch you inside. I wanted to ask you directly." She stopped. Then, "Actually, do you want to sit down? I can see you've been on your feet for hours." Emily looked at her. "I have a statement to give. I have maybe 10 minutes. 10 minutes is enough," Varga said. "I just want to ask you one thing." "One thing." "When he fired you, when Holloway took your badge, did you know then that the federal case was already in motion, that this was going to happen tonight?" Emily considered the question. "No," she said. "I didn't know about the federal case. I knew what I'd found. I knew it was enough to matter." She paused. "I didn't know if anyone would do anything about it." Varga wrote something in her notebook. "But you filed the report anyway." "Yes." "Why? If you thought it might not go anywhere." Emily thought about Raymond Cho calling his daughter from the hospital and saying he was doing better. She thought about 47 billing codes for procedures that never happened. She thought about the patient board in the trauma bay tonight, 43 names and the 0 at the end of the fatality column. "Because not filing it was also a choice," she said, "and I couldn't live with that one." Varga looked up from the notebook. "Okay," she said quietly. "Thank you." Emily went to give her statement. The formal statement took 45 minutes instead of the estimated 30, because Emily was thorough and Reyes's team asked follow-up questions, and the follow-up questions generated more follow-ups in the way that these things did when the underlying story was more complex than the visible surface of it. By the time she signed the documentation, it was 12:47 a.m., and the building had gone to its genuine overnight quiet, the kind that only existed after midnight when the administrative staff had gone home and the day's crisis had settled into its own aftermath. She was collecting her canvas tote from the locker room. She'd left it there when the derailment started, just set it down and walked back into the department, when Delilah called her. She almost didn't answer. Then she answered. "I went home," Delilah said, without preamble. "Couldn't sleep, turned on the news." "Yeah. They're running the statement, Klein and the General." A pause. "They used your name about 14 times." "I know. How are you doing?" Emily sat down on the bench in the locker room. The room was empty. The overhead light hummed faintly. "I'm okay. Tired." "You should be tired. You ran a 43-case MCE on an empty stomach and no badge." A pause. "I reorganized the supply staging area tonight, by the way. I figured out the retrieval time was too long." "I noticed," Emily said. "It helped." "Good." Another pause. The particular kind of pause that meant something was coming that the person wasn't sure how to phrase. "The board is going to have to do something. With everything that happened tonight, with the federal case, they can't just let the department go back to the way it was." "No," Emily said. "They can't. Okafor and I talked before she left. We think the department needs someone who isn't afraid of administration." Delilah said it carefully. "Someone who knows what this department can do when it's run right." Emily looked at the locker room wall, at the canvas tote in her hands, with the compression socks and the granola bar and the photo of her and her sister at the lake. "Get some sleep, Delilah," she said. "You too." She hung up. She sat in the locker room for another minute. Then she walked out through the empty corridor, past the trauma bay. Its board clean now, the night team moving quietly through it, and into the lobby. Maddox was gone. His aides were gone. Through the lobby windows, she could see that 2 of the 3 Blackhawks had already left. Only one remained in the field across the street, running lights still on, waiting. He'd left a card on the chair where he'd been sitting. Just a card. Plain military issue with his name and a contact number. On the back, in handwriting that was precise and slightly cramped, 4 words. Call me when you're ready." She put the card in her pocket. She pushed through the lobby doors and walked out into the night air, and the one remaining Blackhawk was still there across the street, its rotors turning at idle, and the city beyond it was doing what cities did at 1 in the morning, moving slowly, lights here and there, the particular suspension of a place in the hours when most of its residents were asleep. She stood on the sidewalk and breathed. She had no job. She had a federal case with her name in it. She had a statement on record. She had a card in her pocket and a canvas tote over her shoulder and a pulled muscle in her left shoulder that was going to be genuinely unpleasant tomorrow morning. She had Arthur, who was going to make it, Rosalind, who was going to make it, Sophia's mother, who was going to make it. 43 names on a board and a 0 at the end. She had Patricia Cho, who had asked if anyone tried. She had turned to walk toward the parking lot when the lobby doors opened behind her. She turned back. It was Reyes. He had his phone in one hand and a tablet in the other, and his expression had changed from the controlled professional neutrality he'd worn all evening into something more direct. "Ms. Hayes." He was moving toward her with the specific urgency of someone who had just learned something significant. "I need to show you something." She waited. "The federal database snapshot from 72 hours ago," he said. "The team in D.C. has been running a full comparison against tonight's modified version. They found the changes Ray made, which we expected." He stopped in front of her. "But they also found a second layer of modifications, older, made approximately 2 months ago." She went still. "Someone accessed Raymond Cho's record 2 months ago and made changes we didn't know about," Reyes said. "Specifically, they removed a secondary attending notation, a second physician who had signed off on the original treatment plan before the transfer." He turned the tablet toward her. "The name that was removed was flagged by the comparison software and recovered from the metadata." She looked at the tablet. The name was Dr. Priya Okafor. Emily stared at it. "She co-signed the original treatment plan," Reyes said, "before the transfer was authorized, which means she was on record as approving the treatment approach that the transfer disrupted." He paused. "It also means she was aware of the patient." "That's not—" Emily stopped. "Thought. Co-signing a treatment plan isn't the same as authorizing a transfer. She may not have known about the transfer at all." "That's possible," Reyes said, "but her name was in the record, and someone removed it 2 months ago, and that someone had system-level access." He looked at her steadily. "Ms. Hayes, we need to know whether Dr. Okafor had any knowledge of what Holloway and Ray were doing with patient transfers." Emily looked at the parking lot, at the dark and the streetlights, and the empty street beyond. She thought about Okafor moving through the trauma bay tonight, the competence, the stamina, the moment in the supply room where she'd owned what she'd done wrong about Emily's firing, the face that had been honest about what it was. She thought about Okafor saying, "I told myself it wasn't my business." She thought about a 64-year-old man calling his daughter from a hospital bed. "I need to see the full comparison report," Emily said. "The complete metadata recovery. Every access, every modification, in chronological order." "I can get you that," Reyes said. "And I need to know exactly what was in the co-signature notation before it was removed," she said. "The full text. What she signed, what date, what the notation said about the treatment plan going forward." Reyes was already pulling it up. Emily stood on the sidewalk outside Meridian General at 1:04 in the morning and looked at the screen Reyes held toward her, and what she saw there made her close her eyes for exactly 1 second. Because the notation Okafor had co-signed 2 months ago, the one that had been removed from Raymond Cho's record by someone with system-level access, was not an approval of the treatment approach. It was a dissent. Okafor had documented in the formal attending notation her disagreement with the direction of Raymond Cho's care. She had noted that transfer to a lower acuity facility was not in the patient's best interest given his current status. She had named the risks. She had signed it. And someone had deleted it, which meant Okafor hadn't been complicit. Okafor had been silenced, the same way Emily had been silenced, the same mechanism, the same institutional hand, just operating in a different field, not a termination letter, not a public humiliation, but a deleted line in a database that made a physician's documented objection disappear as if it had never existed. "She didn't know it was removed," Emily said. It wasn't a question. We don't know that yet, Reyes said carefully. She documented a descent, Emily said. You don't document a formal descent in a patient record and then help cover up the outcome. That's not... Those two things don't go together. She looked at him. She's going to need to be told, tonight, that her name was in that record, that her descent existed, that it was removed. Reyes was quiet for a moment. That's not standard. I know it's not standard. She held his gaze. She spent tonight running that department on no backup, and then went home and couldn't sleep because she was thinking about whether she'd done enough for her patients. And she has a notation in a deleted record that says she tried to stop Raymond Cho's transfer, and she doesn't know it exists, and she doesn't know it was taken from her. She paused. She deserves to know. Reyes looked at her for a long moment. Then he made a call. He spoke quietly, briefly, and when he hung up, he said, Someone from the investigation team will contact her in the morning. First thing. Tonight, Emily said. Ms. Hayes. Tonight, she said again. Quiet, not aggressive, not demanding. The same tone she used when she told the surgical team that Rosalind Mercer's pressure was not going to hold another 20 minutes. The tone of someone who had assessed the situation and knew what the right answer was. She's awake. She's watching the news. She already knows something happened in that building tonight. Call her tonight. Another pause. Longer. Tonight, Reyes said. He made a second call. Emily stood on the sidewalk and looked at the city and thought about what it meant to have something you'd said taken away from you so completely that you stopped knowing you'd said it. Okafor had written those words into Raymond Cho's record and believed they were there and moved on, the way you did when you documented something and trusted the system that held the documentation. And the system had been eating its own evidence for months. She was still standing there when Reyes finished the second call and came to stand beside her. They'll reach her in the next 30 minutes, he said. Thank you, Emily said. He was quiet for a moment, then, You've given us more tonight than you know. The compliance report, the screenshots, the Ray identification, the connection to the Cho transfer. This case was solid before tonight, but what you provided fills 3 separate evidentiary gaps that we'd been working around. She looked at him. I'm telling you, he said, because I think you should know that it mattered. All of it, even the parts that cost you. She nodded once. She picked up her canvas tote from where she'd set it on the sidewalk. She looked at the last remaining Blackhawk across the street. Its running lights were still on, still waiting. She was going to go home. She was going to sleep, badly, for maybe 5 hours. And then she was going to wake up and drink actual coffee and sit with everything that had happened and figure out what came next. She didn't know yet what next looked like. She had a card in her pocket with 4 words on the back and a city full of hospitals that were probably running their emergency departments with the same institutional gaps that Meridian General had been running its with, and a specific set of skills that had proven tonight, in the most definitive way possible, that they were still functional. She had options. She was almost to the parking lot when Reyes said her name one more time. She turned. The 2 board members who were in the conference room tonight, he said. The ones who were cooperating. He paused. They've given us something else, something about the parent management company, the one that holds the controlling interest across all 4 facilities. What about it? The company isn't just managing hospitals, Reyes said. The billing fraud was generating cash flow that was being moved through a subsidiary structure. He looked at her steadily. The Federal Financial Crime Team has been building a parallel case for 8 months. Tonight's operation was coordinated with them, but we didn't have the patient harm component locked down well enough to move on the larger case. He paused. We have it now. Emily looked at him. How much larger? She said. Reyes said a number. She stood very still. It was not a number you associated with a single hospital. It was not a number you associated with 4 hospitals. It was a number that implied a structure that had been running long before Grant Holloway became CEO of Meridian General and would have kept running long after him if nobody had noticed the 47 billing codes in a trauma wing supply audit. How many facilities total? She asked. Across the network? He paused. 19. She stood in the parking lot of Meridian General at 1:11 in the morning and understood that the thing she had found, the thing she had been fired for finding, was not the bottom of something. It was the entrance. And somewhere inside the building behind her, in the administrative conference room where two frightened board members were talking to federal investigators, the full shape of it was beginning to come into view. The 19 facilities, the subsidiary structure, the 8 months of parallel investigation, all of it converging on a single compliance report filed by a nurse who had gone to the compliance office on a Tuesday afternoon, because going to the compliance office was what you did when you found something wrong. The running lights of the Blackhawk across the street pulsed once, steady and slow. Emily took out Maddox's card. She looked at the 4 words on the back. Then she took out her phone. She called him at 1:13 in the morning. He picked up on the second ring, which meant he'd been awake, which she'd expected. 19 facilities, she said. Reyes just told me. A pause. Not surprise. Maddox didn't do surprise on the phone any more than he did it in person. I know about the 19. You knew before tonight? Yes. She looked at the card in her hand. That's why you came yourself, not just for the arrest. The arrest was federal jurisdiction. I came because the patient harm component of this case has implications for military medical contracting. 2 of the 19 facilities in that network hold active DoD service contracts. He paused. Military families have been receiving care at facilities that were systematically defrauding them and in some cases providing substandard care to manage costs. She stood in the parking lot and let that settle. You needed someone inside who could speak to the patient care failures, she said, not the billing mechanics, the actual harm to actual people. We needed someone credible, he said, with clinical standing and documented evidence and no financial relationship with the network. Another pause. You were already doing it. I didn't ask you to do anything tonight that you weren't already doing. That was true. It was also a careful way of saying something more complicated, that her compliance report had been the missing piece in a federal case that had been building for 8 months, and that his presence tonight had been partly operational and partly deliberate, and that the line between those two things was thinner than it looked. She could be angry about that. She turned it over and found that she wasn't quite. She was tired, and the night was cold, and 19 facilities was a number that reorganized her understanding of what she'd walked into when she'd opened that supply audit 3 weeks ago. What do you need from me? She said. A conversation, he said. Not tonight. When you've slept. He paused. There's a federal military joint task force being assembled around the network case. They're going to need someone who understands both the clinical and investigative dimensions, who can walk into a facility and identify patient harm patterns before they become body counts. She was quiet. That's not a nursing job, she said. No, he said. It's not. I'd need to know the full scope, the structure, what the role actually looks like day to day. That's what the conversation is for. She put the card back in her pocket. Across the street, the last Blackhawk's rotors increased in pitch. Very slightly, the aircraft settling into readiness. Get some sleep, Lieutenant, Maddox said. I haven't been a lieutenant in 4 years. Get some sleep anyway. She hung up. She stood in the parking lot for one more moment. Then she walked to her car, put the canvas tote on the passenger seat, and drove home through a city that was mostly asleep and didn't know yet what had happened inside one of its hospitals tonight, or what it meant, or how far the shape of it actually extended. She found out about Okafor the next morning. She'd slept 5 hours and 20 minutes, which was approximately what she'd predicted. She woke up to 17 missed calls, 6 of which were from numbers she didn't recognize and assumed were journalists, 3 from her sister in Wyoming who had seen something on the news and was using escalating degrees of all caps in her text messages, 1 from Reyes confirming her statement was formally processed, and 1 from a number she didn't have saved that turned out, when she called it back, to be Priya Okafor. Okafor answered immediately. They told me last night, Okafor said. Her voice was different from the supply room voice, different from the trauma bay voice, raw in a specific way, like something that had been under pressure for a long time had finally been allowed to release. About the notation, about what I wrote. I know, Emily said. I wrote that dissent, and I checked the record twice in the following week, and it was there both times, and then I got pulled onto another case, and She stopped. I thought it was there. It was there, Emily said. Someone removed it after the fact. That's not on you. If I checked again. Okafor. She said it the way she said things when a situation required directness rather than comfort. You documented your dissent. You did what you were supposed to do. Someone with system-level access deleted your words from the record. That's a crime that was committed against you and against Raymond Cho. It is not a failure of yours. Silence on the line. I keep thinking about him, Okafor said. About Raymond Cho. About the fact that I was in that record, I disagreed with the transfer direction, and he still ended up at Eastfield. Because the people with the authority to act on your dissent chose not to, Emily said. That's the system that failed, not you. Another silence. Longer. They want me to give a statement, Okafor said, to the federal investigators about what I saw in that record, about the dissent, about anything else I may have observed regarding patient transfer patterns. You should give it, Emily said. Everything you remember, even things that seemed routine at the time. Will you? Okafor stopped. Started again. Would you be willing to talk me through what that's going to look like? Before I go in. Emily looked at her kitchen wall. At the window, where the morning light was coming in at an angle that meant it was later than she usually let herself sleep. Yes, she said. Come over. Okafor arrived 40 minutes later with 2 coffees from the place on Delancey Street, which told Emily she'd looked up the address somehow and had left home before Emily had even agreed to the meeting. She was still in the clothes she'd apparently slept in, or not slept in, and she looked like the specific version of exhausted that had been marinating since before the derailment and had now become something structural. They sat at Emily's kitchen table, and Emily walked her through what a federal witness statement looked like, what the investigators would ask, and how to answer it. Not the legal mechanics, which were Reyes's domain, but the practical reality of sitting in a room and being asked to reconstruct events from memory with precision and honesty, including the parts where the memory was incomplete, including the parts where you weren't sure. What if I can't remember specifics? Okafor asked. Then you say you can't remember specifics. Don't fill the gaps. The investigators know what a genuine memory looks like versus someone trying to construct one that fits. What if what I remember makes things worse for me? Emily looked at her. Do you have anything to hide? No. Then what you remember doesn't make things worse for you. It makes things clearer. She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. The only thing that makes things worse is the gap between what you know and what you say you know. Okafor was quiet for a moment. You've done this before. Not this exactly. She paused. Close enough. The army. Close enough, Emily said again. Okafor accepted that. She drank her coffee. She looked around the kitchen, which was a small kitchen in a small apartment that had a field manual on the counter and a photo on the refrigerator, and not much else in the way of decoration. What are you going to do now? Okafor asked. After all of this. Emily thought about the card in her pocket and the conversation she was supposed to have when she'd slept. I'm not sure yet. The board is going to approach you, Okafor said. Whatever form it takes. They'd be idiots not to. Probably. Is that what you want? To come back here? Emily looked at the window, at the morning light. She thought about the trauma bay last night, and the 43 names, and the way the department had organized itself around a working center of gravity and held. She thought about Delilah reorganizing the supply staging without being asked. About Torres double-checking his own work because the environment had made him careful. About the specific satisfaction, not pride, something quieter than pride, of watching people do things correctly under pressure. She thought about 19 facilities. About military families, at 2 of them receiving care from a system designed to extract money from them while minimizing the cost of keeping them alive. I don't know yet, she said. I think what I want might be bigger than this. Okafor looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded, slow. Okay, she said. And then, for what it's worth, what you did last night. Not just the emergency response, the Cho documentation, the screenshots, the Ray identification, all of it. She paused. I've been a physician for 10 years. I've worked with a lot of nurses. I've never... She stopped. I should have said something when he fired you. You said that already. I'm saying it again, because last night in the supply room I said it like I was clearing a debt. That wasn't what I meant. She met Emily's eyes directly. I mean, I should have said something because it was the right thing to do, and I didn't, and that had nothing to do with 14 critical patients. I was afraid, and I want to say that clearly. Emily looked at her. Okay, she said. Thank you. They finished the coffee. Okafor left to give her statement. Emily called her sister in Wyoming and spent 20 minutes reassuring her that she was fine, that no, she wasn't injured, that yes, the news coverage was accurate in its broad outlines, if somewhat compressed in its timeline, that she would explain everything properly when she had more than 20 minutes and less caffeine deficit. Her sister said, Emily, you have to stop doing things like this to me, in the specific tone of someone who has been saying this for their entire adult life and knows it will have no effect and says it anyway, because that's what you do. I know, Emily said. I love you. I love you too. Sleep. I slept. More. She didn't sleep more. She showered and ate actual food, and then she sat at her kitchen table with her laptop and read everything that had been published about Meridian General and the federal investigation and the arrest of Grant Holloway and Dennis Ray, which was considerable and growing by the hour. Salome Varga's piece had run at 3 a.m. It was long and careful and specific in the way that good investigative journalism was specific, not speculative, not sensational, but precise in a way that made the thing it was describing feel completely real to anyone who hadn't been standing in the building when it happened. Varga had Emily's quote about not filing the report not being an option. She'd used it near the end, after the billing fraud details and the patient death, and the federal scope of the investigation, which was the right placement. It let the facts speak first, and the human decision behind them come last. The quote read differently in print than it had felt in the saying of it. It felt larger. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. General Maddox's portion of the statement had been picked up and run independently by multiple outlets. The specific line, I know what courage looks like, and it doesn't always look the way people expect, was apparently the kind of sentence that reproduced itself across the internet with a speed that suggested it had landed somewhere people needed it to land. She read it 3 times in 3 different publications and then closed that tab. The federal indictments came down 6 weeks later. Grant Holloway was charged with healthcare fraud, obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, and 2 counts related to patient endangerment, the Raymond Cho transfer being the primary case, a second transfer from 8 months prior being the one the board members had provided documentation on. Dennis Ray was charged with evidence tampering, conspiracy, and 7 counts of fraudulent billing authorization. 3 executives from the parent management company were charged separately with federal wire fraud and money laundering, the latter charge carrying the kind of sentencing exposure that made even their very expensive lawyers look briefly uncertain in the courtroom. Emily was not in the courtroom for the indictments. She was in a conference room in a federal building 3 states away, going through her second week of consultations with the Joint Task Force that Maddox had described in 4 words on the back of a business card. The role didn't have a clean title yet. That was something she'd said yes to before the structure was fully defined, which was not something she'd typically do, but the scope of what the task force was attempting, auditing patient care standards and harm patterns across the 19 network facilities, identifying systemic failures that existed below the line of what billing fraud investigations typically reached, was something she understood with the specific understanding that came from 14 months of night shifts and 3 deployments and an 11-day document trail built in secret. She wasn't a nurse in this role. She wasn't quite an investigator either. She was something in between, something the task force was still figuring out how to classify, while simultaneously using everything she brought to it. Maddox had said the conversation would clarify things. It had, mostly. What it had clarified most clearly was that the work was real and that the 19 facilities contained patient harm that no one was currently looking at with the right eyes, and that those patients deserved someone looking at them with the right eyes. That had been enough to say yes to. She was reviewing a facility audit from the 3rd week when her phone buzzed with a message from Reyes. Holloway plea negotiation collapsed. Going to trial, FYI. She put the phone down and went back to the audit. All right, The trial was 14 months after the night of the derailment. Emily testified on the fourth day. She was in the witness box for 3.5 hours, 2 hours from the prosecution, 90 minutes from Holloway's defense, which had assembled an experienced team that spent the first 40 minutes trying to establish that her compliance report had been motivated by a personal grievance related to a workplace dispute, and the next 50 minutes discovering that this strategy had some structural problems. The problem was the documentation. The 47 billing codes, the metadata discrepancy, the timeline of access logs, the Raymond Cho transfer record, the deleted Okafor notation. The documentation was what it was, and Emily had built it before she had any reason to anticipate being fired. And the sequence of events made the personal grievance argument run backward rather than forward. Holloway's lead defense attorney was good. She was genuinely good, and she pushed on every seam she could find, and Emily gave her credit for that while also not giving her anything useful. Emily answered every question directly and completely, and without ornamentation, which was a way of testifying that defense attorneys found difficult to work with because there was nothing to pull on. You couldn't spin a witness who wasn't spinning. When the defense was finished, the prosecution asked one redirect question. Ms. Hayes, the defense has suggested that your compliance report was filed in anticipation of the employment dispute with Mr. Holloway. Can you tell the court when you first accessed the billing records that formed the basis of your report? 23 days before I was terminated, Emily said. And when did you first raise concerns with your direct supervisor about the discrepancies you found? 19 days before termination. And the formal compliance report? 11 days before. And on the day you were terminated, before Mr. Holloway removed your badge, was there any indication from him or from hospital administration that your employment was in jeopardy? No, she said. I was told the morning of my termination that I was meeting with the CEO to discuss departmental staffing allocation. The courtroom was quiet. Thank you, the prosecutor said. Nothing further. She stepped down from the witness box and walked out of the courtroom and stood in the corridor outside and breathed for approximately 30 seconds. The pulled muscle in her left shoulder had been fine for months. She'd been sleeping adequately. She had a small apartment in a different city now, closer to the federal building where the task force operated, with a window that got good morning light and a kitchen large enough for an actual table. She was fine. She was more than fine. She was still standing in the corridor when the courtroom door opened, and a woman she didn't immediately recognize came out. Middle 50s, dark coat, the particular quality of someone who had been sitting in a public room for hours while working very hard to control their face. The woman stopped when she saw Emily. She looked at her for a moment. Patricia Cho, the woman said. We spoke on the phone. Emily straightened. I remember. Patricia looked like her voice had sounded that night. Someone who had processed a great deal and was still processing, still carrying it, but was standing up while she carried it. She'd been in the gallery. Emily hadn't known she was there. I wanted to see him, Patricia said. In person. I needed to see what he looked like when someone told the truth about what he did. How did he look? Patricia was quiet for a moment. Small, she said. He looked small. Emily nodded. My father would have been 66 this year, Patricia said. He was learning to paint. He took a class at the community center after he retired. He wasn't very good at it. Her voice stayed even. He showed me his paintings every time I visited. They were terrible. He thought they were wonderful. Emily didn't say anything. She let that sit where it was meant to sit. I'm glad you filed the report, Patricia said. I know it cost you. It cost less than not filing it would have. Patricia looked at her. Something in her expression shifted. Not breaking, not the way it might have shifted in a lesser moment, but opening slightly, the way a window opens. Thank you, she said. Same words as the phone call, different weight. I'm sorry about your father, Emily said. I mean that specifically, not as a thing to say. I know, Patricia said. I can tell. She went back into the courtroom. Emily stood in the corridor for another minute and then walked to the elevator and went down to the building's lobby and outside into an afternoon that was overcast and slightly cold, the same kind of early spring weather as the night of the derailment, and she stood on the steps and thought about nothing in particular for a while. The verdict came down 3 weeks later. Guilty on all counts. Holloway, Ray, and all three management company executives. The sentencing phase extended the proceedings by another 2 months, and when the sentences came down, they were the kind that ended careers permanently and consumed significant portions of remaining lives. Not abstractions, but real and specific and consequential in the way that consequences needed to be when the harm they addressed was real and specific and had taken someone's father away before he'd gotten any better at painting. Emily wasn't in the courtroom for the verdict either. She was in a hospital in a different state, walking a facility audit with a federal compliance officer, pointing at a pattern in the patient transfer logs that had been invisible until someone looked at it with the right eyes. She heard about the verdict from Reyes, who texted 3 words, all counts, guilty. She was in the middle of a transfer log when she read it. She put her phone back in her pocket and kept going. That evening, she called her sister. She called Delilah, who had been promoted to charge nurse supervisor, and said she had opinions about the new staffing ratios that she was preparing to document and submit and expected nobody to listen to. Emily told her to document them anyway, thoroughly, and keep copies somewhere that didn't belong to the institution. I know, Delilah said. I learned that from someone. She called Okafor, who had given her statement, whose deleted dissent had been entered into the federal record and restored to Raymond Cho's file by court order, who had subsequently been asked by the hospital board to lead a new patient safety oversight committee with actual authority and an actual budget. Okafor had agreed under specific conditions she'd negotiated herself, with a contract that Emily had looked over at Okafor's request and found to be exactly as protective as it needed to be. The committee meets for the first time next week, Okafor said. Good, Emily said. What are you going to do first? Audit the transfer authorization process, Okafor said. From the beginning, every step. Start with the access logs, Emily said. The metadata tells you things the records themselves don't. I know, Okafor said. You told me that 3 times. I'll probably tell you again. Probably, Okafor said. I'll pick up. She hung up. She made one more call. Maddox picked up on the second ring, as always. Verdict came in, she said. I know. How are the 2 DoD contract facilities? Better than they were, he said. The compliance framework your team installed is running, still needs monitoring. It'll always need monitoring, she said. That's not a failure state. That's what ongoing looks like. A pause. How are you? She considered the question the way she considered most things, practically, without too much decoration. She was tired in the way she'd been tired for months, the productive kind of tired that came from doing work that used everything. Her shoulder was fine. She'd called her sister twice this week. She'd been to the community pool twice, which was something she'd started doing in the new city because she needed something that was purely physical and purely quiet, and swimming was both. She was not, she had decided, someone who needed to be the center of the story she was in. She was someone who needed the story to have the right ending. Not for her specifically, but for the people whose names were on the transfer logs and the billing codes and the deleted notations, the people whose care had been carved up and sold and shuffled around by people in suits in conference rooms who had never once stood at a patient's bedside at 2 a.m. and talked them through being afraid. I'm good, she said. Actually good. The task force wants to expand the audit scope, Maddox said. There are 3 additional hospital networks flagged by the financial crime team. Send me the preliminary data, she said. Already did. Check your secure email. She almost smiled. You sent it before you told me. I sent it an hour ago, he said. I assumed. You assumed right, she said. She hung up. She sat at her kitchen table in her apartment with the good morning light and opened her laptop and pulled up the secure email and began reading the preliminary data on 3 hospital networks. And she read the way she always read. Fast, looking for the pattern beneath the pattern, the thing that was slightly out of alignment with everything around it, the detail that someone had hoped nobody would look at long enough to see. She was good at this. She'd always been good at this. She'd spent years doing it in conditions that made a billing audit look like quiet work, and she'd come back from those conditions and stood in civilian spaces and been told, in one way or another, that the things she was good at didn't matter here, that she should be quieter, smaller, more deferential to the structures of authority around her. That the instinct to say something when something was wrong was an inconvenience that could be managed by the right kind of institutional pressure. Grant Holloway had tried to manage it. He'd stood in a trauma bay and told her she was finished and taken her badge off her neck and assumed that was the end of something. He'd been wrong about what endings looked like. She thought sometimes about the moment after the badge hit the floor, the 11 people who'd watched and said nothing. She didn't think about it with bitterness anymore. Bitterness was a conclusion, and what that moment actually was, she'd come to understand, was a question. The question every person in that room had been asked, and most of them had answered by going still. The question that kept getting asked, in rooms like that, in hospitals like that, in every institution where the people with the least power were asked to absorb the costs of protecting the people with the most. The question wasn't whether to be brave. Brave was a word people used when they meant something harder than bravery. The question was simpler and more difficult. When you find the thing that's wrong, and you know it's wrong, and you know that saying so is going to cost you, what do you do with that knowledge? You could set it down. Lots of people did. She understood why. The cost was real, and the outcome was uncertain, and the institution around you was large and patient and very good at waiting you out. Or you could write 2 pages, clearly, thoroughly, with sources and documentation and cross-references. You could send it through the proper channel and hope someone was listening. You could take screenshots and email them to yourself and show up to work the next day and the day after that. Building towards certainty until the morning when someone removed your badge in front of 11 colleagues and the evidence you'd gathered was the difference between a federal case that held and one that didn't. The preliminary data on the 3 new networks was substantial. It would take weeks to map properly. She made a note in the margin of the first page. Not a digital note, an actual handwritten margin note on the printed page, which was a habit she'd never broken because physical documentation didn't get deleted by someone with system-level access, and moved to the second. Outside her window, the morning light was shifting. The city was doing what it did, going about its business, full of hospitals and people in those hospitals and systems surrounding those people that were mostly working and occasionally, quietly, catastrophically, not. She had work. She kept reading. The woman they had tried to erase was not finished. She had never been close to finished. And the institutions that believed they could silence someone simply by taking back a plastic badge had never understood the most basic thing about people who had learned, in the hardest possible classrooms, that the right thing and the easy thing were almost never the same, and that knowing the difference and acting on it anyway was the only kind of strength that actually lasted.